The dust cloud on the horizon was too large for a single rider, and for Sophia Preston, that could only mean one thing: they were coming for her. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she urged her exhausted horse onward, the animal's labored breathing matching her own panicked gasps. 3 days of hard riding had left both of them near collapse, but she couldn't stop, not when what awaited her back in Sacramento was a wedding ring and a lifetime of misery. The year was 1878, and the California wilderness stretched before her like a vast, unforgiving canvas of browns and greens. Sophia had fled in the dead of night, leaving behind the comforts of her father's estate and the suffocating future he had arranged for her with Cornelius Hargrove, a banker twice her age with cold eyes and a reputation for cruelty disguised as business acumen. The horse stumbled, nearly sending Sophia tumbling to the ground. She managed to stay mounted, but the animal's faltering stride told her what she already knew: they couldn't continue much longer. The distant ridgeline of mountains offered some hope, but they were still miles away, and the pursuing party was gaining ground. "Just a little farther," she whispered, patting the horse's sweat-slicked neck. Her own appearance was a far cry from the prim and proper daughter of one of Sacramento's most prominent businessmen. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins, her blue riding dress was torn and stained, and dirt smudged her face. None of that mattered now. All that mattered was freedom. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Sophia spotted a thin tendril of smoke rising from a cluster of trees beside a creek. A campfire, perhaps. People. Help, maybe, or danger, she had no way of knowing. But with her horse nearly spent and her pursuers less than an hour behind, she had little choice. Steering her mount toward the smoke, Sophia approached cautiously. As she drew closer, she made out a small cabin nestled among the trees, a corral with several horses, and a man chopping wood. He straightened as she approached, setting his axe aside and watching her with wary curiosity. He was tall and lean, with broad shoulders that spoke of a life of physical labor. A cowboy's hat shaded his face, but she could see he was young, perhaps a few years older than her own 22 years. When he pushed his hat back, she saw eyes the color of the summer sky and a face weathered by sun and wind. "Hello there," he called, his voice carrying across the small clearing. "You look like you've been riding hard." Sophia pulled her horse to a stop, suddenly aware of how desperate she must appear. "I have," she admitted, her voice cracking from thirst. "I need help." The man approached, his movements careful as if approaching a spooked animal. "Name's Ethan Walker," he said, reaching up to help her dismount. "And you look like you're in a heap of trouble, miss." Sophia's legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground, and Ethan steadied her with strong hands. "Sophia Preston," she managed. "And yes, I am in trouble. There are men following me, my father's men and others." Ethan's expression hardened as he glanced toward the direction she'd come from. "How far behind?" "Less than an hour, I think. My horse can't go much further," he nodded once decisively. "Get inside. I'll take care of your horse." "You don't understand," Sophia protested, clutching his arm. "These men won't simply pass by. They're looking for me specifically. My father has ordered them to bring me back at any cost." Ethan's eyes met hers, and something passed between them, an understanding perhaps, or simply the recognition of a kindred spirit who valued freedom above all else. "They won't find you here," he said with quiet certainty. Those 5 words, so simple, yet filled with promise, nearly brought Sophia to tears. She had been running for days, terrified and alone, and here was a stranger offering her shelter without question. "Why would you help me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know me." A small smile tugged at the corner of Ethan's mouth. "Let's just say I've got my own reasons for staying clear of certain folks. Now get inside while I tend to your horse and erase your tracks." The cabin was small but neat, with a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a bed in one corner, and various supplies organized along the walls. It was clearly a man's dwelling, lacking feminine touches, but it felt safe in a way Sophia hadn't experienced in days. She sank into one of the chairs, fatigue washing over her like a wave. Through the window, she watched Ethan lead her horse to the corral, then gather a pine branch to sweep away their tracks. He worked methodically, erasing all evidence of her arrival before taking care of her exhausted mount. By the time he entered the cabin, Sophia had gathered herself enough to stand. "Thank you," she said, "but I still don't understand why you'd risk helping me." Ethan set his hat on a peg by the door and ran a hand through his sandy hair. "Around these parts, we don't ask too many questions about why folks are running. Most everyone's running from something." He moved to a cabinet and took out a canteen and a tin cup. "Water." Sophia nodded gratefully, accepting the cup with both hands. The water was cool and sweet, and she drank deeply before speaking again. "I'm running from a forced marriage," she said, deciding honesty was the least she owed this stranger. "My father arranged it with a business associate, a man old enough to be my father with a reputation for cruelty." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Your father sounds like a real piece of work." "He wasn't always," Sophia said softly. "After my mother died, he changed. Business became everything, and I became an asset to be leveraged." The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. Before Ethan could respond, the sound of approaching horses reached them. Sophia's heart leapt to her throat as she looked frantically around the small cabin for a place to hide. "Calm down," Ethan said quietly, moving to the window. "I've got a place they won't look." He crossed to a bearskin rug near the fireplace and pulled it aside, revealing a trapdoor. "Root cellar," he explained, lifting the door. "Not comfortable, but it's deep and dark. They won't find you." Sophia hurried to the opening and climbed down the rough wooden ladder. The cellar was indeed dark and smelled of earth and stored vegetables, but it was dry and seemed secure. Ethan handed down a lantern but shook his head when she reached for matches. "No light," he warned. "The floor's dirt, but there's a crate you can sit on. Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear. These men, they won't hurt me without cause, and I'm good at playing dumb." With that, he closed the trapdoor, and Sophia heard the scrape of the rug being pulled back into place. Moments later, the sound of men's voices reached her, muffled by the floor above but clear enough to recognize the sharp, authoritative tone of her father's foreman, Douglas. "Afternoon," she heard Ethan say, his voice casual, almost lazy. "Something I can help you gentlemen with?" "We're looking for a young woman," Douglas replied. "Miss Sophia Preston, daughter of Theodore Preston of Sacramento. She's run away from home and her father's mighty worried." "Can't say I've seen any young ladies out this way," Ethan said. "Most days I don't see anyone at all." "Her horse's tracks led in this direction before we lost them," another voice said. Thomas, one of her father's ranch hands. "Mind if we look around? Free country," Ethan replied easily. "Though I don't know what you expect to find. Been here by myself since spring, working this patch of land." Sophia held her breath as footsteps moved above her, men entering the cabin. She could hear them moving around, opening cupboards, looking behind furniture. Would they notice the trapdoor beneath the rug? "Whose extra horse is that in the corral?" Douglas asked, his tone suspicious. "Bought him off a passing drover 3 days back," Ethan said. "My old mare's getting on in years. Needed a stronger animal for the work around here." "That horse looks mighty tired for just standing in a corral," Thomas observed. "Worked him hard today," Ethan replied. "Clearing new ground east of here. He'll toughen up." The tension in the cellar was unbearable as Sophia listened to the men searching, their footsteps sometimes passing directly overhead. Once, someone stepped on the rug above the trapdoor, and she nearly cried out in fear. "What's in the root cellar?" Douglas asked suddenly, and Sophia's blood ran cold. "Root cellar's empty this time of year," Ethan said. "Last winter's stores are used up and this year's harvest isn't in yet. Just dirt and spiders down there." There was a pause, and Sophia could almost feel Douglas weighing his suspicions against Ethan's casual confidence. "We've been tracking this girl for 3 days," Douglas said finally. "Her father is offering a substantial reward for her safe return." "That's so." Ethan sounded mildly interested. "What'd she do? Besides run away, I mean." "That's not your concern," Douglas snapped. "If you see her, you're to bring her to Watsonville and ask for me at the Frontier Hotel." "Understood." "Sure thing," Ethan agreed easily. "Though I doubt a Sacramento society girl would make it this far into the back country. These hills aren't friendly to those who don't know them." There were a few more minutes of conversation, then the sound of boots on the wooden floor as the men left. Sophia remained frozen in place, listening as horses galloped away from the cabin. Even then, she didn't move, fearful it might be a trick. Several long minutes passed before the trapdoor opened, and light flooded the cellar. Ethan's face appeared in the opening, his expression grim. "They're gone," he said, "but they'll be back. They're splitting up to search the area." He extended a hand to help her up. "We need to move you somewhere safer." Sophia climbed out of the cellar on shaky legs, gratitude and fear warring within her. "Where can I go?" "They'll have riders watching all the roads." Ethan moved to the window, scanning the landscape. "There's an old line shack up in the high meadow. It's well hidden and only used during summer grazing. My friend Samuel keeps it stocked with basic supplies." He turned to face her. "It's rough living, but you'd be safe there until we figure something out." "We?" Sophia asked, surprised by the inclusion. A faint smile crossed Ethan's face. "Looks like you've got yourself an accomplice, Miss Preston." "I don't much care for men who try to force women into marriages they don't want." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within Sophia. For days, she had been alone with her fear and desperation. Now, somehow, she had found an ally. "Why are you really helping me?" she asked again, needing to understand. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "My sister," he finally said, his voice soft. "She was forced to marry a man our father chose, a man with money and influence, and a terrible temper. She died last winter after a fall down the stairs." The bitterness in his voice was palpable. "So when I see a woman running from a forced marriage, I reckon I know which side I'm on." The raw pain in his admission silenced any further questions Sophia might have had. Instead, she simply nodded. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'm sorry about your sister." Ethan acknowledged her words with a nod, then turned to practicalities. "We'll leave at dusk. Less chance of being spotted. Your horse needs rest, so you'll ride with me. Better anyway leaves no new tracks for them to find." As the afternoon wore on, Sophia helped Ethan prepare for their journey. They packed food, water, and basic supplies, and Ethan cleaned and loaded an extra revolver, which he showed Sophia how to use. "Ever fired one before?" he asked. She shook her head. "Father didn't approve of women handling firearms." "Well, where you're going, it's a skill worth having," he said, guiding her hand into the proper position. "Hopefully you won't need it, but better prepared than sorry." As dusk approached, Ethan brought his horse a sturdy roan gelding to the cabin door. "Time to go," he said, securing their packs. "Stay close, and if I tell you to run, you run." "Understand." Sophia nodded, tucking the revolver into the pocket of the riding jacket Ethan had given her. It was far too large, but warmer than her torn dress alone. They set out as the first stars appeared, Sophia riding behind Ethan, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance. He led them through dense forest where no path was visible, occasionally dismounting to check their surroundings or listen for pursuers. The journey took hours, climbing steadily into higher elevations where the air grew noticeably cooler. Finally, near midnight, they reached a small clearing where a crude log structure stood, nearly invisible against the backdrop of trees. "The line shack," Ethan explained, helping Sophia dismount. "Not much to look at, but it's sturdy enough." He was right, it was little more than a one-room shelter with a stone fireplace, a wooden platform that served as a bed, and some shelves holding supplies. But after days of running, it looked like a palace to Sophia's weary eyes. Ethan quickly built a small fire, careful to use dry wood that would produce minimal smoke. As warmth filled the tiny cabin, Sophia felt the tension of the past days begin to ease slightly. "You should be safe here for a few days," Ethan said, laying out some food on a rough wooden table. "I need to go back to my place. If I'm gone too long, it'll raise suspicions, but I'll bring more supplies when I return." The thought of being alone again sent a spike of fear through Sophia. "How long will you be gone?" "2 days, maybe 3, he said. "There's food, water, and firewood enough. Keep the fire small and only during the coldest hours. Rest of the time, use blankets to stay warm." Sophia nodded, trying to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "I'll be fine," she said. "You've already risked enough for me." Ethan studied her face for a moment. "You're tougher than you look, Miss Preston. Most society ladies wouldn't have made it as far as you have." "I'm not most society ladies," she replied with a small smile. "And please call me Sophia." "Sophia," he repeated, and something in the way he said her name made her heart beat a little faster. "Get some rest. I'll leave at first light." She watched as he spread a blanket on the floor near the door, leaving the platform bed for her. Such a gentleman, she thought, even in these strange circumstances. As she lay down, exhaustion quickly overtook her, and she fell into the first peaceful sleep she'd had since fleeing Sacramento. Sophia woke to early morning light filtering through the single window of the shack. Ethan was already up, rekindling the fire and preparing a simple breakfast of coffee and hardtack. "Morning," he said when he noticed her stirring. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in days," she admitted, rising and attempting to smooth her wrinkled dress. She felt grubby and disheveled, acutely aware of her unwashed state and tangled hair. As if reading her thoughts, Ethan nodded toward a bucket by the door. "There's a stream about 50 yards behind the shack. Water's cold but clean. I'll step out while you freshen up." Gratefully, Sophia took the bucket and a small piece of soap Ethan offered. Once alone, she hurried to the stream, where she washed as thoroughly as possible in the icy water. The cold was shocking but refreshing, and she felt more human afterward. When she returned to the shack, Ethan had breakfast waiting. They ate in companionable silence until Sophia finally asked the question that had been troubling her. "What happens when your friend Samuel comes to use this place?" "Samuel won't be up here until late July when the high meadow grass is ready for grazing," Ethan explained. "And even then he'd understand. He's a good man. And what about me? I can't hide here forever." Ethan considered her question carefully. "No, you can't. Your father's not likely to give up easily, especially if this marriage is important for his business." He sipped his coffee. "How far were you planning to run?" "Oregon, maybe," Sophia said. "Or further north, somewhere I could start fresh where no one knows me." "That's a hard journey for a woman alone," Ethan observed. "Even harder when people are looking for you." Sophia's chin lifted slightly. "I'll manage. I've saved some money and I can work. I'm not afraid of hard labor." A smile tugged at Ethan's lips. I believe you." He stood and began gathering his few belongings. "When I come back, we'll talk more about getting you north. For now, stay hidden. Don't leave tracks and keep the fire small." With that, he was gone, leaving Sophia alone with her thoughts and the vast silence of the forest. The first day passed slowly. Sophia occupied herself by cleaning the small shack and taking inventory of the supplies. There was enough food to last several weeks if she was careful, plus hunting and fishing gear she didn't know how to use. There were also books, 3 well-worn novels, and a Bible which she was grateful for. By the second day, the isolation began to weigh on her. She'd never been alone for so long, with nothing but her thoughts for company. To distract herself, she ventured out briefly, staying close to the shack and carefully avoiding leaving tracks as Ethan had taught her. The forest was beautiful, vibrant with late spring growth and the songs of birds. In another circumstance, she might have found it peaceful. Now, every sound made her jump, imagining her father's men closing in. On the third day, when Ethan still hadn't returned, worry began to gnaw at her. Had he been caught, questioned, or had he simply decided she wasn't worth the trouble? By midday of the fourth day, Sophia had worked herself into such a state of anxiety that she nearly cried out when she heard a horse approaching. Heart pounding, she grabbed the revolver and positioned herself behind the door, ready to run if necessary. Relief flooded her when Ethan's voice called out, "It's just me, Sophia." She rushed to open the door, so glad to see him that she nearly threw her arms around him before catching herself. He looked tired, with several days' worth of stubble darkening his jaw, but his eyes brightened when they met hers. "You had me worried," she admitted as he dismounted and began unpacking supplies. "Ran into some complications," he said grimly. "Your father's men have been questioning everyone in Watsonville. They're offering $100 for information leading to your whereabouts." Sophia's stomach clenched. "That's a fortune around here." "It is," Ethan agreed, carrying the supplies inside, "and it's got people talking. Plus, there's wanted posters with your description up in town." "Wanted?" Sophia gasped. "For what crime?" "Theft, apparently," Ethan said, his expression dark. "Your father claims you stole family heirlooms when you left." "That's a lie," Sophia exclaimed. "I took nothing but my mother's locket and the clothes on my back." "I figured as much," Ethan said, "but it gives him a legal reason to pursue you beyond just being a controlling father." Sophia sank onto a chair, the implication sinking in. "So now I'm not just running from a marriage, but from the law as well." "Looks that way." Ethan began unpacking the supplies, more food, clean clothes that might actually fit her, and several newspapers. "I thought you might want to see what they're saying," he explained, handing her the Sacramento Bee. The article was small but damning. "Daughter of prominent businessman flees with family treasures." It quoted her father lamenting his daughter's disturbed state of mind and expressing concern for her safety, even as he offered the reward for her capture and the return of the allegedly stolen items. "He's making me sound like I'm mentally unsound," Sophia said, anger replacing her initial shock. "This is his way of ensuring no one will believe me if I speak out against the marriage." Ethan nodded grimly. "It's clever, I'll give him that. Makes it harder for you to show your face anywhere." "What am I going to do now?" Sophia asked, genuine fear creeping into her voice. Ethan sat across from her, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that. Getting you to Oregon is still possible, but we need to be smart about it." He spread out a rough map on the table. "The stage routes and main trails will be watched. But there are other ways north, harder trails, less traveled." "You keep saying we," Sophia observed. "You don't have to risk yourself further for me." Ethan's gaze was steady when it met hers. "I'm already involved. Besides, you won't make it alone, not with people looking for you at every turn. There was something in his eyes, a warmth, a connection that made Sophia's heart beat faster. In just a few days, this stranger had become her protector, her ally, perhaps even her friend. And if she was honest with herself, she felt something more stirring whenever he was near. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "Let's get you to safety first," he replied. "Then we can worry about debts." They spent the evening planning. Ethan knew the mountain trails well, having worked as a guide before settling on his small homestead. The journey to Oregon would take weeks, but he believed they could avoid main settlements and stay ahead of any pursuit. "We'll leave in 3 days," he decided. "I need to make arrangements, get more supplies, and I should check in with Samuel, let him know I'll be gone for a while." "Won't people be suspicious if you disappear right when I'm being searched for?" Sophia asked. "Already thought of that," Ethan said with a slight smile. "I've let it be known I'm heading to Nevada to visit my ailing uncle. Even left a letter with the general store to be posted to a fictional address in Carson City." Sophia was impressed by his foresight. "You've thought of everything." "Not everything," he admitted. "This journey won't be easy, Sophia. We'll be facing rough country, bad weather, and the constant fear of discovery." "Are you sure you're ready for that?" "I'm sure I'm not ready to marry Cornelius Hargrove," she replied firmly. "Everything else is secondary." As darkness fell, they continued talking, no longer just about escape plans but about their lives, their hopes. Sophia told Ethan about growing up in Sacramento, about her mother's death when she was 16, and how her father had gradually changed from a loving parent to a cold businessman who viewed her as property to be traded. In turn, Ethan spoke of his childhood in Missouri, his journey west after the war, and his dream of building a prosperous ranch of his own someday. He told her more about his sister, Margaret, whose tragic marriage and death had left him with a deep distrust of arranged unions. "She was brilliant," he said, staring into the fire. "Could have been anything, done anything, but our father saw her only as a way to secure a business alliance." "I'm so sorry," Sophia said, reaching across the table to touch his hand briefly. "She deserved better." "Yes, she did," Ethan agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "Just like you do." Their eyes met across the table, and Sophia felt something shift between them, a deepening of understanding, perhaps, or the first stirrings of something more profound. Whatever it was, it sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. The next 2 days passed in preparation. Ethan brought more supplies on each visit, proper traveling clothes for Sophia, preserved foods that would last the journey, medicines, and tools they might need. He also taught Sophia basic survival skills: how to build a fire, how to find north using the stars, how to signal him if they became separated. On the evening before their planned departure, Ethan arrived with news that sent a chill through Sophia. "Your fiancé is here," he said without preamble as he entered the shack. "Cornelius Hargrove arrived in Watsonville yesterday with more men and more money. The reward's up to $200 now." Sophia's blood ran cold. "He's come himself." "Seems he doesn't trust your father's men to find you," Ethan said grimly. "He's a determined man, I'll give him that, and smart. He's got people watching the roads, asking questions in every settlement within 50 miles. "Did you see him?" Sophia asked, a tremor in her voice. "From a distance," Ethan confirmed. "Older fellow, well-dressed, cold eyes, carries himself like he owns everything and everyone he sees." "That's him," Sophia whispered. "Did he see you?" "No, I made sure of that, but his presence complicates things. We need to leave tonight, not wait until morning." The urgency in his voice spurred Sophia to action. They quickly gathered their supplies, packed them onto Ethan's horse, and prepared to leave. As Sophia took one last look around the small shack that had been her refuge, she felt a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. She was leaving safety for uncertainty, yet she wasn't alone anymore. They set out under a cloudy sky, with only the faintest moonlight to guide them. Ethan led the way, sometimes on horseback with Sophia behind him, sometimes on foot when the terrain grew too treacherous to ride. They traveled through the night and into the dawn, pushing northward through forests and across streams, always staying far from established trails. By midday, they had covered nearly 15 miles of difficult terrain. Exhausted, they made camp in a dense thicket beside a small creek, where the trees provided cover, and the running water would mask any sounds they made. "We should rest," Ethan said, helping Sophia down from the horse. "We'll move again after dark." Too tired to argue, Sophia sank onto a fallen log while Ethan set up a small, nearly smokeless fire and prepared a simple meal. As they ate, the reality of their situation settled over her. She was now truly on the run, not just hiding. And this man, this near stranger, had tied his fate to hers. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly. "Risk everything for me." Ethan looked up from the fire, his blue eyes reflecting the flames. "Maybe I needed to do something right," he said. "After failing my sister, maybe I needed to help someone else escape the same fate." "Is that the only reason?" Sophia asked, her heart beating faster as she dared to voice the question. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "No," he admitted, "not the only reason." He didn't elaborate, and Sophia didn't press, but something had changed between them, an acknowledgement of feelings neither was ready to fully express. They rested through the afternoon, taking turns keeping watch. As dusk approached, they packed up and continued their journey. This pattern became their life over the next several days, traveling by night, resting during daylight hours, always alert for signs of pursuit. The terrain grew more challenging as they pushed northward, leaving California and crossing into the wilder regions of southern Oregon. They avoided towns and settlements, skirting around them at a safe distance. Occasionally, Ethan would leave Sophia concealed in a secure location while he ventured into a small settlement for supplies, always returning with newspapers that they scoured for mentions of the search. It was clear that Theodore Preston was not giving up. The reward for information continued to increase, and the newspapers carried stories painting Sophia as mentally unstable and potentially dangerous. The allegations of theft had expanded to include claims that she had taken not just jewelry, but a substantial sum of cash as well. "He's desperate," Sophia said after reading one particularly vicious article. "He must need this marriage to Hargrove very badly to go to such lengths. Any idea why?" Ethan asked, repacking their supplies. Sophia frowned, thinking, "Father's business has been struggling since the banking panic last year. Perhaps Hargrove offered financial assistance in exchange for me." The thought made her stomach turn, but it fit with what she knew of both men. Her father, once a loving parent, had grown increasingly obsessed with his business affairs after her mother's death. And Cornelius Hargrove was known for using his wealth to acquire things he desired, regardless of whether they were for sale. "Well, he's not getting you," Ethan said firmly, a protective edge to his voice that warmed Sophia despite the chill in the air. As they continued northward, the landscape changed, becoming more rugged and densely forested. Game was plentiful, and Ethan supplemented their provisions with fresh meat when possible. He also taught Sophia to identify edible plants and berries, skills she'd never imagined needing in her previous life. Nearly 2 weeks into their journey, disaster struck. They were crossing a swift-running river, with Ethan leading the horse carefully across a shallow ford when the animal lost its footing on the slippery rocks. Sophia, riding behind Ethan, was thrown into the icy water. The current immediately swept her downstream, tumbling her over and over until she could no longer tell which way was up. She fought desperately, breaking the surface long enough to gasp for air before being pulled under again. Just as her lungs began to burn and darkness crept into the edges of her vision, strong arms encircled her waist, pulling her toward the shore. Ethan dragged her onto the rocky bank, both of them coughing and gasping. "Sophia," he called, his voice ragged with fear. "Sophia, are you all right?" She nodded weakly, unable to speak past the water she'd swallowed. Her entire body trembled with cold and shock, and her sodden clothes clung to her like a second skin. "We need to get you warm," Ethan said urgently, looking around for their horse. But the animal was nowhere to be seen, having apparently continued across the river and disappeared into the forest beyond. "See, can I stop?" Sophia stammered through chattering teeth. "And need to keep moving." "Not like this," Ethan said firmly. He quickly gathered wood and started a fire, despite the risk it posed. "We have no choice. You'll die from the cold if we don't get you dry." He helped her closer to the flames, then turned his back as she stripped off her wet outer clothing. Wrapped in the one blanket that had been tied to Ethan's saddle and thus spared a soaking, Sophia huddled near the fire while Ethan hung her clothes on branches to dry. "The horse?" she asked when she could speak without stuttering. "Gone," Ethan confirmed grimly, "along with most of our supplies. I've still got my rifle and revolver, and the money was in my coat pocket, but we've lost pretty much everything else." The implications were serious. They were now on foot in unfamiliar territory, with limited supplies and the constant threat of pursuit. But they were alive, and for the moment, that had to be enough. As her clothes dried and the warmth of the fire seeped back into her bones, Sophia found herself watching Ethan. He moved with a quiet efficiency, making the best of their situation without complaint. His own clothes were still damp, but he'd refused to take the blanket, insisting she needed it more. "Thank you," she said softly, "for saving my life." He glanced up from where he was preparing a makeshift shelter of pine boughs. "Couldn't very well let you drown," he said with a small smile. "Not after all the trouble we've gone to." But there was something in his eyes, a depth of feeling that belied his light tone. He had been truly frightened for her, Sophia realized. And that realization stirred something warm in her chest, something that had been growing since the day he'd hidden her in his root cellar. They spent the night by the river, with no choice but to wait for their clothes to fully dry. Despite the loss of their supplies, Ethan managed to catch fish for their dinner and construct a shelter that kept the worst of the night's chill at bay. In the close confines of the shelter, sharing body heat became necessary for survival. Sophia lay beside Ethan, the blanket covering them both, and felt safer than she had any right to feel given their precarious situation. "We'll find a settlement tomorrow," Ethan murmured, his breath warm against her hair. "Get new supplies, maybe even horses if we can afford them." "Is it safe?" Sophia asked. "Someone might recognize me." "It's a risk we have to take," he replied. "We can't continue without supplies, especially now that the weather's turning colder." He was right, of course. October had arrived and the nights were growing increasingly bitter. Without proper gear, they wouldn't survive long in the wilderness. The next morning they set out on foot, following the river downstream. Ethan believed it would eventually lead them to a settlement, and by midday they spotted smoke from chimneys in the distance. "That's probably pine wood," Ethan said, referring to a small logging town he'd heard of but never visited. "Small enough that news might not have reached here yet, but big enough to have what we need." They approached cautiously, with Sophia wearing Ethan's hat pulled low to shadow her face. The town was indeed small, just a single street with a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a handful of rough buildings that served as homes and businesses. "Wait here," Ethan instructed, leaving Sophia concealed in the trees at the edge of town. "I'll see what I can find out before we risk going in together." Sophia watched anxiously as he walked toward the general store, trying to appear casual despite their bedraggled state. She had almost begun to hope when she saw him speaking amicably with the storekeeper. Then everything changed. A group of riders entered the town from the opposite end, 5 men, well armed and purposeful. Even at a distance, Sophia recognized Douglas, her father's foreman, and beside him, the cold, aristocratic figure of Cornelius Hargrove himself. They dismounted outside the saloon, directly across from the general store where Ethan stood. For a moment, Sophia thought they might not notice him. But then Hargrove turned, his gaze landing squarely on Ethan, and something in his posture changed a predator spotting prey. Sophia's heart hammered in her chest as she saw Hargrove speak to Douglas, who then approached Ethan with a false friendliness that was visible even at a distance. She couldn't hear the words exchanged, but she saw Ethan's body tense, saw him glance quickly in her direction before looking away. They suspect, she thought with growing horror. Somehow they know. Her fears were confirmed moments later when Douglas signaled to the other men, who moved to surround Ethan. From her hiding place, Sophia could only watch helplessly as they closed in. Then, with a suddenness that took everyone by surprise, Ethan drew his revolver and fired into the air. The shot sent townsfolk scattering and momentarily startled Douglas and his men. In that brief window of confusion, Ethan broke free, running toward the edge of town, not toward Sophia, but in the opposite direction, deliberately drawing attention away from where she hid. His diversion worked. The men mounted their horses and gave chase, following Ethan into the forest to the south, while Sophia remained hidden to the north. For long minutes, she stayed frozen in place, torn between fear for herself and terror for Ethan. The sound of distant gunshots made her flinch, tears springing to her eyes as she imagined the worst. When the sounds of pursuit faded, Sophia faced an impossible choice: remain hidden and abandon Ethan to his fate, or risk capture herself by trying to help him. It was no choice at all. Gathering her courage, she circled around the edge of the small town, avoiding open spaces where she might be seen. The general store Ethan had visited was now deserted, its owner having apparently fled during the commotion. Sophia slipped inside, grabbed a sack, and quickly filled it with provisions, food, a canteen, matches, and a heavy coat she found hanging near the door. She left money on the counter, not wanting to add actual theft to the crime she was accused of. Then, following the direction the pursuers had taken, she entered the forest to the south. Finding tracks was nearly impossible for someone with her limited woodcraft, but occasional broken branches and disturbed ground gave her a direction to follow. The forest grew denser as she moved deeper into it, the late afternoon light filtering weakly through the canopy. Fear gnawed at her: fear for Ethan, fear of being alone in this wilderness, fear of capture. But she pressed on, driven by something stronger than fear. She had been walking for perhaps an hour when a hand suddenly clamped over her mouth from behind. She struggled instinctively until a familiar voice whispered in her ear, "It's me. Don't scream, Ethan." Alive, relief flooded through her as he released her and she turned to face him. He was disheveled and exhausted, with a bloody graze along his left arm where a bullet had found him, but he was standing, breathing, alive. Without thinking, Sophia threw her arms around him, holding him tight as tears threatened to spill from her eyes. "I thought they'd killed you," she whispered. His arms encircled her, strong and secure despite his injury. "Not for lack of trying," he murmured against her hair. "They're persistent, I'll give them that." When they finally separated, Sophia noticed how pale he looked. "You're hurt," she said, reaching for his wounded arm. "It's just a graze," he assured her. "But we need to keep moving. I led them on a false trail, but they'll figure it out soon enough." Sophia handed him the supplies she'd gathered. "I went to the store," she explained. "Got what I could." A smile touched his lips despite the gravity of their situation. "Resourceful," he said with approval. "Let's go. We need to put as much distance between us and them as possible before nightfall." They traveled through the night, pushing themselves to the limits of endurance. Ethan's wound, though not serious, clearly pained him, and Sophia insisted on stopping long enough to clean and bandage it properly. "They're not going to give up, are they?" she asked as she wrapped a strip of cloth around his arm. "No," Ethan replied honestly. "Hargrove especially. There's something personal about his pursuit. It's more than just a business arrangement with your father." Sophia shuddered, remembering the cold, possessive way Cornelius had looked at her during their few meetings. "He sees me as a possession," she said quietly. "Something to be acquired and owned." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Well, he can't have you," he said, with such fierce protectiveness that Sophia's heart skipped a beat. They continued northward, avoiding settlements now, knowing that word of their description would have spread. Their progress was slower without horses, and the weather grew increasingly harsh as October gave way to November. They survived on what Ethan could hunt and trap, supplemented by their dwindling store of purchased provisions. One evening, as they huddled beside a small fire in yet another makeshift shelter, Sophia finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "What happens if we make it to Oregon? What then?" Ethan looked up from the rabbit he was skinning. "I know a place," he said. "A small homestead near the Willamette Valley belonged to a friend who died last year. It's abandoned now, but the cabin's still sound. We could stay there at least until we figure out something more permanent." The way he said, "we" made Sophia's pulse quicken. "You'd stay with me?" she asked softly. He set aside his work and met her gaze directly. "Sophia," he said, her name almost a caress on his lips. "I think you know by now that I'm not doing this out of some abstract sense of justice, or even just to honor my sister's memory." "Then why?" she whispered, though part of her already knew the answer. "Because somehow, in the middle of all this running and hiding, I've fallen in love with you," he said simply. "I didn't mean for it to happen, but there it is." The words hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. In that moment, Sophia realized that her own feelings had undergone a similar transformation. What had begun as gratitude had deepened into something far more profound. "I think I love you too," she admitted, the words both frightening and freeing. "I've never felt this way before, like I can be myself, fully and completely, and be valued for who I am, not what I represent." Ethan moved closer, his hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. "You are remarkable, Sophia Preston," he said softly. "Brave and determined and kind. I'd be honored if you'd consider a future with me, whatever that might look like." "I already am," she whispered, and when he lowered his lips to hers, it felt like coming home after a long journey. That night marked a turning point. They were still fugitives, still hunted, but now they were fighting not just for freedom but for a future together. The knowledge gave them renewed strength as they continued their arduous journey. 3 days later, they crossed a ridge and looked down upon a valley that Ethan identified as their destination. In the distance, nestled among trees beside a small creek, stood a cabin simple but sturdy, with a stone chimney and a small cleared area that had once been a garden. "There it is," Ethan said, a note of weary triumph in his voice. "My friend Jackson's place." They approached cautiously, alert for any sign of occupation or danger. But the cabin was as abandoned as Ethan had predicted, dusty and cold but structurally sound. It offered 4 solid walls, a roof, and a fireplace luxury compared to the shelters they'd been constructing in the wilderness. That first evening in the cabin, they allowed themselves to truly rest for the first time in weeks. With a strong fire chasing the chill from the single room, they ate a simple meal and began to take stock of their situation. "The nearest town is about 15 miles east," Ethan explained. "Small place called Riverside. Jackson used to trade there occasionally. It's far enough from the main routes that news of our search might not have reached it yet." "Do you think we're safe here?" Sophia asked, looking around at what might become their home. "Safer than we've been," Ethan replied. "But I don't think we'll be truly safe until your father and Hargrove accept that they can't force you to return." The reality of their situation settled over them. They might need to live in hiding for months, perhaps years. It was a daunting prospect. But as Sophia looked at Ethan across the small table they'd cleared of dust, she knew she preferred this uncertain freedom with him to a life of gilded captivity with Hargrove. In the days that followed, they worked to make the cabin livable. Ethan repaired the roof where it had begun to leak, while Sophia cleaned and organized the interior. They discovered preserved food in the root cellar Jackson had obviously prepared for a winter he never lived to see, and Ethan's hunting skills provided fresh meat. A week after their arrival, Ethan ventured into Riverside for supplies, leaving Sophia with his rifle and strict instructions to remain hidden. Those hours alone were among the longest of her life, filled with anxiety that he might be recognized or captured. When he finally returned, his arms laden with supplies and a grin on his face, Sophia's relief was palpable. "No one there has heard of us," he reported triumphantly. "It's too isolated, too far from the telegraph lines. News travels slowly here." Among his purchases was a simple gold band. That night, beside the fire, Ethan formally asked Sophia to marry him. With tears in her eyes, she accepted, and they exchanged vows there in the cabin, witnessed only by the flickering flames and the stars visible through the window. "It's not legal without a preacher or a judge," Ethan acknowledged, "but it's real to me." "And to me," Sophia assured him, sealing their private ceremony with a kiss. That night they consummated their unofficial marriage, discovering each other with tenderness and growing passion. In Ethan's arms, Sophia found a joy she hadn't known existed, a connection that went beyond the physical to touch something deep within her soul. As winter settled over the valley, they established a routine. Ethan hunted and trapped, occasionally visiting Riverside for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. Sophia tended their home, learning to cook on a wood stove and preserve food for the lean months ahead. Together, they planned for spring, when they would plant a garden and perhaps acquire chickens or a milk cow. It was a simple life, far removed from the luxury Sophia had known in Sacramento, but she found herself happier than she'd been in years. Here, she was valued for her strength, her intelligence, her willingness to work alongside Ethan as an equal partner. And yet, the shadow of their past loomed. Each time Ethan returned from Riverside, Sophia's first question was always whether there had been any news of the search. For months the answer was no, then in early March that changed. "There's a new wanted poster," Ethan said grimly as he unpacked his purchases. "In the general store. It has both our descriptions now and the rewards up to $500. Sophia's hand flew to her throat. "Both of us." "They know we're together," Ethan nodded. "Seems that way. And there's more. The charges have escalated now. They're claiming you stole valuable documents related to your father's business, and I'm wanted for kidnapping and assaulting Douglas during our escape." The news hit Sophia like a physical blow. They had begun to hope that the search might be waning, that her father and Hargrove might eventually accept her disappearance. Now it seemed the opposite was true. The hunt was intensifying. "What do we do?" she asked, fear coiling in her stomach. "Do we run again?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "No," he finally said. "We've made a home here. I won't let them chase us away from it. But if they find us, we'll be more careful," he assured her. "Limit our trips to town, be vigilant." "But we can't live in fear forever, Sophia. At some point, we have to stand our ground." His words were brave, but in the weeks that followed, a new tension entered their lives. Each unusual sound in the forest made them freeze. Each distant rider spotted from their hillside perch sent them into hiding until they could verify it wasn't a threat. Spring came, bringing with it new growth and renewed hope. They planted their garden, and Ethan built a chicken coop, filling it with half a dozen hens purchased from a farmer outside Riverside. Life continued, and despite the constant undercurrent of anxiety, they found joy in their shared work and in each other. In late April, Sophia discovered she was pregnant. The news brought both elation and renewed fear. Elation at the life growing within her, fear for the added vulnerability it represented. "We'll protect our child," Ethan promised, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "No matter what." As Sophia's pregnancy progressed, Ethan became even more protective, taking on more of the physical labor and insisting she rest when she tired. Their love deepened with the anticipation of the child they had created together. One bright June morning, Ethan left for Riverside to purchase additional supplies they would need for the baby. Sophia, now visibly pregnant, remained at the cabin, working on a quilt for their child. The day was warm, and she had opened the windows to let in the summer breeze. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the approach of riders until they were almost upon the cabin. By the time she looked up, it was too late to hide. Through the open window, she saw them 5 men on horseback, led by Douglas. And beside him, his face set in cold triumph, rode Cornelius Hargrove. Terror gripped Sophia as she frantically looked for an escape route. But there was none. They had surrounded the cabin, and in her condition, she couldn't run fast enough to evade them. Instead, she grabbed Ethan's rifle from above the fireplace and positioned herself in the corner where she could see both the door and the window. "Sophia Preston," Douglas's voice called out. "We know you're in there. Come out peacefully and no one needs to get hurt. Go away." She shouted back, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm not going anywhere with you." "Don't be foolish, girl," came Hargrove's cultured tones. "Your father is gravely ill. He's asking for you." The lie was so transparent that Sophia almost laughed. "I don't believe you," she called. "And even if it were true, I wouldn't come. I'm married now with a child on the way. My life is here." There was a moment of silence, then the sound of boots on the porch. Sophia raised the rifle, aiming at the door. "I'll shoot the first man who tries to enter," she warned, her finger on the trigger. The footsteps stopped. Then Hargrove spoke again, his voice dangerously soft. "Where is Walker? Still in town, I presume? Perhaps we should send men to find him." Sophia's blood ran cold. They knew Ethan's name, knew he was likely in Riverside. If they sent men to intercept him, he'd be walking into a trap. "Leave him out of this," she said, unable to keep the fear from her voice. "This is between me and my father." "On the contrary," Hargrove replied. "Mr. Walker involved himself the moment he helped you escape. The charges against him are quite serious: kidnapping, assault, possibly even worse if we decide he's corrupted you against your family's wishes." The only corruption was my father trying to sell me to you, Sophia spat. I left of my own free will, and I'll die before I return. There was a brief consultation outside, voices too low for Sophia to hear clearly. Then Douglas spoke again. We're giving you 1 hour to reconsider, Miss Preston. After that, we're coming in, and we'll bring you back by force if necessary. The minutes that followed were among the most terrifying of Sophia's life. She knew they weren't bluffing, they would indeed break down the door and drag her away. And if Ethan returned while they were here, he would be walking into deadly danger. Her only hope was that he might see the riders from a distance and stay hidden until they left. But knowing Ethan, he would come charging in to protect her, regardless of the risk to himself. As the deadline approached, Sophia found herself praying for Ethan's safety, for their unborn child, for some miracle that might save them from this nightmare. And then, just as the hour was nearly up, she heard at the distant sound of multiple horses approaching at speed. Her heart sank. Had they brought reinforcements? Was her situation even more hopeless than she'd thought? But the reaction of the men outside suggested otherwise. There were shouts of alarm, the sound of weapons being drawn. Through the window, Sophia saw Douglas and his men turn to face the newcomers, their postures tense. Then came a voice she didn't recognize, authoritative and sharp. United States Marshal, lower your weapons. Disbelieving, Sophia crept closer to the window, careful to stay out of sight. A group of at least 10 riders had surrounded Douglas and his men, all armed, all wearing badges that caught the sunlight, and in their midst, looking battered but triumphant, was Ethan. What happened next unfolded with bewildering speed. Douglas and his men were disarmed and placed under arrest. Hargrove protested vehemently, demanding to know the charges. Fraud, for starters, came the marshal's reply. Falsifying legal documents, filing false criminal complaints, attempting to use federal resources to pursue a personal vendetta. He gestured toward Ethan. Mr. Walker here has provided quite a compelling account of your activities, backed by evidence we've verified independently. Sophia could scarcely believe what she was hearing. When the marshal approached the cabin, she finally lowered the rifle, though she kept it within reach. Mrs. Walker. The marshal called. I'm Marshal James Collins. You're safe now. May I come in? Cautiously, Sophia opened the door, her free hand instinctively cradling her swollen belly. The marshal tipped his hat respectfully. Madam, he said, your husband has quite a story to tell. And the evidence he brought us was compelling enough that a federal judge in Portland issued these arrest warrants immediately. Evidence? Sophia repeated, confused. What evidence? Letters, came Ethan's voice as he approached, his face breaking into a relieved smile at the sight of her. From your father to Hargrove, detailing their arrangement. Turns out your father was embezzling from his investors and Hargrove was helping him cover it up in exchange for. He trailed off, his expression darkening. In exchange for me, Sophia finished quietly. Yes, Ethan confirmed. And when you ran, they panicked. The false charges, the rewards, it was all to get you back before you could potentially expose their scheme. But how did you get these letters? Sophia asked, still struggling to understand this sudden reversal of fortune. Ethan's smile turned slightly sheepish. Remember when we lost the horse in the river, and I told you we'd lost all our supplies? He reached into his jacket and pulled out a waterproof pouch. Not quite all. I found these in your father's saddlebag the day I helped you escape. I didn't understand their significance then, but I kept them safe, thinking they might be valuable to you someday. Sophia stared at him in amazement. You've had evidence that could clear our names for months, and you never told me. I didn't want to give you false hope, he explained. I wasn't sure they would be enough. It wasn't until I heard about the new wanted posters that I decided to risk approaching the federal authorities. The marshal cleared his throat. The letters implicate both Preston and Hargrove in financial crimes that span state lines, making it a federal matter. We've been building a case against them for some time, but lacked direct evidence until now. As the reality of their situation sank in, Sophia felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, the constant fear that had shadowed them for so long. "So we're free?" she asked, scarcely daring to believe it. "Truly free?" "Yes," Ethan confirmed, taking her hands in his. "No more running. No more hiding." In the days that followed, the full story emerged. Theodore Preston had been running a sophisticated investment fraud for years, using new investors' money to pay returns to earlier ones while siphoning off millions for himself. Hargrove, as his banker, had facilitated the scheme in exchange for various considerations, including Sophia's hand in marriage, which would have given him access to the Preston family's social connections. When Sophia fled, they feared she might have discovered evidence of their crimes, prompting the increasingly desperate pursuit. The irony that she had indeed escaped with damning evidence, though unwittingly, was not lost on anyone. With Hargrove and Douglas in federal custody, and warrants issued for Theodore Preston's arrest, the immediate threat was gone. The marshal assured them that all charges against Sophia and Ethan had been dropped, and that they were free to live their lives without fear of legal repercussions. "What will happen to my father?" Sophia asked as they sat around their table with Marshal Collins, discussing the case. "He'll face trial when we apprehend him," the marshal said. "The evidence suggests he's fled to Mexico, but we'll find him eventually. The charges are serious. He could spend the rest of his life in prison." Despite everything, Sophia felt a pang of sadness for the father she'd once loved. "He changed after my mother died," she said softly. "It was like he lost his moral compass." "Grief affects people in strange ways," Ethan observed, squeezing her hand gently. "But it doesn't excuse what he tried to do to you." "No," Sophia agreed. "It doesn't." As summer turned to fall, life at the cabin settled into a new rhythm, one free from the constant fear of discovery. Ethan made their marriage legal at the courthouse in Riverside, and they began making long-term plans for their homestead. The garden thrived, the chickens multiplied, and they acquired a milk cow and 2 horses. In late October, as the first snow dusted the mountain peaks, Sophia gave birth to a son they named Jackson, after the friend whose cabin had become their sanctuary. The birth was long and difficult, but with the help of a midwife from Riverside, both mother and child emerged healthy and strong. As Ethan held his son for the first time, tears glistened in his eyes. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "A family, a home, peace." "Neither did I," Sophia said, watching her husband and son with a heart so full it felt it might burst. "Not until that day you hid me in your root cellar and told me they wouldn't find me." Ethan smiled at the memory. "Best decision I ever made," he said, "though I think I knew even then that you were going to change my life completely." "For the better, I hope," Sophia teased. "In every way possible," he assured her, leaning down to kiss her tenderly. Life wasn't perfect. There were hard winters and dry summers, times when crops failed or illness struck. News eventually reached them that Theodore Preston had been captured in Mexico City and brought back to face justice. He was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Sophia wrote to him once, not seeking reconciliation but offering forgiveness and closure. Whether he read the letter, she never knew, as no reply came. It was enough for her to have made peace with that chapter of her life. As the years passed, their family grew. Jackson was joined by a sister, Margaret, named for Ethan's lost sibling, and later by another brother, Thomas. The cabin expanded as well, with Ethan adding rooms as their needs changed, until it became a proper farmhouse with a wide porch where they could sit in the evenings, watching their children play in the yard. Occasionally, when the children were asleep and the night was quiet, Ethan and Sophia would reminisce about their journey, the desperate escape, the weeks of running, the fear and uncertainty. Those experiences had forged their bond, testing it in fire and finding it unbreakable. "Would you do it again?" Sophia asked one such evening as they sat on the porch swing, her head resting on Ethan's shoulder. Knowing all the danger, all the hardship we'd face, Ethan's arm tightened around her. "In a heartbeat," he said without hesitation. "The moment I saw you riding up to my cabin, exhausted and desperate but still fighting, I think part of me already knew you were worth any risk. And here I thought you were just being noble," Sophia teased. "Well, that too," Ethan admitted with a chuckle. "But mostly, I think fate brought you to my door that day, and I'm grateful every day that I was home when you arrived." Sophia thought of the life they'd built together, the love they shared, the children they'd raised, the home they'd created from an abandoned cabin in the wilderness. All of it had begun with a desperate flight and 5 simple words. "They won't find you here." Those words had been a promise Ethan had kept through danger and hardship, across hundreds of miles and countless obstacles. They had become the foundation of a life neither of them could have imagined on that fateful day when a terrified young woman had arrived at a lonely cabin, fleeing a future that had been chosen for her. Instead, she had found the freedom to choose her own path. And that path had led here to love, to family, to happiness hard-won and therefore all the more precious. As the sun set over their valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sophia looked at the man beside her and knew with absolute certainty that running had been the right choice. Not just running from something, but running towards something better, a life built on love rather than obligation, on choice rather than coercion. It hadn't been easy. Nothing truly worthwhile ever was. But as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sophia Preston Walker knew she wouldn't change a single step of the journey that had brought her home.